I have to respect her audacity at this point, Admiral Krieger commented, after the High Matriarch's speech had come to an end. Leaning up a little bit on the elbow of her healthy arm, she had listened to the entire thing. Now she glanced up at James, who still stood next to her bed. His mechanical arm was crossed in front of his chest, while the other's elbow was leaned onto it, as the hand belonging to the organic arm thoughtfully glided over his mouth and chin. The Admiral frowned. "You don't believe a word of that is true, do you?" James's eyes moved a bit as she had seemingly pulled him out of some deep thoughts. He then released a low, groaning exhale and let his hand fall down to his side as he shook his head. "Do you want me to be literal?" he asked her, hinting towards some of the things that had been part of the Zodiatos' speech, which had simply been facts they were all aware of. Still, despite the brief moment of smart arsery, the comment itself made it obvious that James was entirely aware that those were not what his mother was referring to. Therefore, she didn't bother dignifying it with a reply, as she simply waited for him to drop it and actually engage in the conversation instead of trying to deflect. It took him a moment before he sighed and shook his head one more time. "I don't know," he finally replied, and his voice sounded just as unsure as the sentence suggested. "Don't get me wrong, I'm not buying her change of heart. Her reaching out and wishing to be more open to the world is a ploy to earn herself favor, that much is for sure. But attacking a core world? We know she doesn't consider herself above violent terror attacks, but this goes against everything she wants, and she's not even trying to pin it on anyone this time. This doesn't put Deathworlders into a bad light in any way. In fact, it makes it clear core worlders are just as susceptible to violent radicalization as any other people, which heavily supports our stance. Sure, she gets some brownie points for playing nice after, but can that really be worth it? And she is so enamored with core worlds. It's just... Even if she is trying to spin it to her advantage, I think she may actually be sorry for what happened to the Quavery at the very least. But I'm really not sure. I certainly wouldn't vouch for her anytime soon. She might just be a whole lot crazier than even I anticipated. And that's coming from the guy whose arm she had cut off. His lips then shifted a bit as his arm went back up to his chin, stroking over it gently with his thumb and index finger as his expression darkened a bit. "Either way, as long as we can't prove one thing or the other, it might be a bad idea to try and call her out on it," he then added. "The Zodiatos are already taking full responsibility for the attack, and trying to make sure she is personally blamed for it without any necessary evidence would likely be seen as petty. Especially since large parts of the galaxy are still not convinced that we actually weren't behind the attacks that we deny being associated with. Much as I hate to say it, it might be in our best interest to play ball this time. Though I will leave it up to the folks back home if we are going to accept any reparations or not. Personally, I wouldn't want to give off the impression that our forgiveness can be bought, but on the other hand, denying an at least outwardly honest attempt at reconciliation outright is also not a great look. I think my personal grudges are a bit too clear for me to make any of the lasting decisions on this one." Admiral Krieger blinked once as she looked up at her son, and she couldn't suppress a smile from creeping across her lips. "Well, look at you," she whispered in a warm tone, and then shifted her gaze slightly to look over at the small nightstand. Speaking up a bit louder, she requested, "James, would you be a dear and get me something out of the nightstand, please? Celestin usually leaves it in the second drawer for me whenever I end up here." James seemed a bit surprised, most likely both by the sudden request and the tone in which it was made. "Sure," he said, and turned to reach for the drawer. Reaching inside, he pulled out a blue opaque folder with a dark pattern that spread across it almost like veins. The item was clearly well loved and had therefore seen better days. The surface was rough and the edges and corners frayed from regular use. The back, keeping the folder together, had gotten very thin over time, and in some places it had even broken open, so that it was only held together by a few thin strips of material and a thick layer of scotch tape at this point. As he held the item, James stared at it for a moment. His face made it clear that he wasn't sure what exactly his mother wanted with something like this. However, there was also a hint of uncertain recognition in his eyes, even if he didn't seem able to quite place where it came from. After a moment of quietly pondering, he handed the item over. "There you go, ma'am," he said, as she took it out of his hand. "Thank you, treasure," the Admiral replied, already feeling the usual warm, nostalgic feeling come over her, even as she just looked at the familiar folder. Still sitting next to her on the side of her bed, Nia scooted a bit closer as she curiously leaned in to also inspect the item. "What is it?" she then asked after a few moments of not being able to figure it out for herself. Meanwhile, the Admiral was already carefully opening the folder, very cautious to not do any more damage to the precious item as she handled it, even in her weakened state. Her fingers gently glided along the frayed edge as she turned the covering page to open it, a familiar tingling feeling filling her as she revealed what was underneath. "Just some memories," she replied to Nia's question, turning the folder slightly towards Nia so that she could more easily look inside along with her. The first page underneath the cover showed a slightly crude but well-proportioned drawing of the silhouette of a human body, though some areas broke out of the silhouette look to instead offer a highly detailed, even if still quite crudely drawn, insight into the body of the depicted person. The heart, lungs, liver, intestines, and kidneys all had a detailed depiction, as well as the femur in one leg as a representation of all bones, the bicep as a representation of muscles, and a patch of skin on the neck. Each of the more detailed depictions also had long arrows pointing towards them, on the other end of which a description was scribbled onto the side of the page. Artificially enhanced bone structure, density, possible integration of metals, larger heart volume, also more blood more easily enriched with oxygen, aquatic animals, addition of hemocyanin, production of cellulose, chitinase, etc. for more easily varied diet, adaptable skin pigmentation, chameleon, octopus, bioluminescence, addition of fatigue-resistant white musculature, addition, replacement, ratio. Those were just some of the descriptions added to the many features shown on the silhouette. In the corner of her vision, the Admiral could see how Nia's eyes wandered over the page. Given her own background in biology, her expression turned thoughtful at the ideas proposed by the drawings the longer she inspected it. Meanwhile, James also had leaned over from where he was standing a bit to look at the contents of the folder, and immediately his eyebrows rose a bit as that vague feeling of recognition he seemed to be feeling earlier apparently finally found its point of reference. In a smooth and gentle gesture, the Admiral turned to the next page. This one contained many small, scribbled and sometimes, from a lacking skill in artistry, barely recognizable pictures of different animals, all of which again had a brief explanation written next to them, as well as a very helpful title that helped more easily identify what each drawing was meant to depict. Sea cucumber, regenerative ability, naked mole rat, near anaerobic metabolism, tardigrade, Pompeii worm, heat resistance, brown bear, atrophy blockers, lobster, hemocyanin, telomerase, octopus, adaptive pigmentation, shark, electrodetection, lateral line organ, both adapted, viper, heat pits, possibilities, spider, silk, glowworm, bioluminescence, bombardier beetle, exothermic weapon, gecko, electrostatic object attraction, electric eel, electric weapon. Wait, that's... James mumbled as he took a step closer and looked down at the page containing his very own penmanship. Or, well, at least that of a very motivated and enthusiastic younger version of himself. You made it for me all the way back from my promotion to Commander, the Admiral confirmed for him with a sincere warmth in her voice that she couldn't deny whenever she looked at the crudely but ever so honestly made gifts she had once received from him. It was supposed to help me with my work and give me the strongest guys. She reminisced with a chuckle filling her words as she gently turned the page again. This time, the next page showed the drawing of a face in a very typical from a how-to-draw manga sort of art style. Various features have once again been added to it in greater detail with shorter explanations. Some of them just showed where and how some of the animalistic features mentioned on the previous page, such as heat pits or a lateral line organ, would be integrated exactly. The eyes also had an arrow, though the augmentations proposed to them didn't have a direct source in the animal kingdom and were more of a general enhancing sort of nature. Lastly, Both the ears and the nose had vaguely mechanical apparati implanted into them that seemed to represent more of an idea than an actual concept. Hard to naturally enhance without large cosmetic changes. Sensitive nerve-connected sensors better solution, was the explanation attached to those. The Emerald lifted her hand to carefully slide the tips of her fingers over the drawing as she admired it. To this very day, she remembered the day a tiny James had excitedly sat on her lap and intricately explained every detail about the depictions and explanations, and all his thoughts of how to make and integrate them, until they had reached this very part. "I don't know much about how to do all of the mechanical stuff for these," he had admitted. His tiny voice still burned into her mind as it turned ever so bashful at his confession, while he looked down at his own drawing with a tiny frown. "But I'm sure we can make it work. We just need someone who's really good with robotics and all that stuff." The smile on the Admiral's face widened a bit more, as she pulled her hand away from the drawing again, afraid it would eventually start to smudge if she touched it too often. "You always had such big ideas," she murmured, just loud enough to be heard by her children. "Yeah, big ideas is right," Nia said with mild amusement, as she leaned a bit closer to try and properly decipher the sometimes not too well-written words on the page. It was obvious that she had some choice words about some of those ideas on her mind as she read over them. James crossed his arms and looked away for a moment, his lips shifting into a slight frown that was so very like the one he wore back then. "Give me a break. I was like, what, 10 maybe?" he mumbled in his defense, while his mechanical fingers began to drum on his organic bicep. Nia giggled gleefully at her brother's embarrassment, while the Admiral simply kept smiling. Suddenly, someone cleared their throat, pulling everyone's attention over to the two women who had drifted very awkwardly into the background of the conversation, as the quite intimate moment had gone on. Much to her embarrassment, Admiral Krieger had to admit that she had actually momentarily forgotten about their presence in the room, and it seemed like James and Nia weren't faring much better. With her ear gently twitching, tail swaying, and a slight, embarrassed redness on her face, She'd briefly endured all the eyes that were pulled onto her from her deliberate sign of life, before she slowly approached the Admiral, closely followed by Tuya. "So, what exactly is that, ma'am?" The feline then carefully asked, in a tone that suggested she wasn't quite sure if she was even allowed to ask that question here, obviously still feeling very much out of place. Perhaps even more so than before, after briefly being forgotten. The Admiral felt honestly bad about that. She hadn't meant to exude those two from this moment. By no means, in fact. She has simply gotten caught up in it. Smiling at the two women invitingly, she gave them a reassuring nod to try and take the fear of not belonging from them just a bit, before she began to explain. "Many years after I was promoted to Commander, James came to me with his folder as a gift and a proposition," she explained. Her earlier grin coming back to her as she remembered his tiny, determined face. "I guess you could call it his idea of a super soldier, in a way. All kinds of abilities of other animals that could, very theoretically, be transferred onto humans to make them fitter, as he put it. And for everything he didn't find a good genetic solution for, he added some possible mechanical enhancements as flair." She snickered briefly, and made a slightly flourishing gesture with the hand of her healthy arm to support her sentence. "His suggestion was to take this to my superiors, who would obviously love it, immediately make these sort of soldiers, and naturally promote me again." She exhaled a bit wistfully, and her gaze fell back down onto the page. "I think he saw how proud I was of my promotion, and this was his way of trying to help me get even more." Sheeta and Tuya glanced at each other for a moment, their expressions hard to read. Tuya then joined up with Nia to get a closer look at what was actually on the page, while Sheeta moved closer to James and gave him a nudge with her elbow. "Genetically modified super soldiers, huh?" she said with a gently teasing tone, before replacing her nudging gesture with an affectionate placement of her head onto his shoulder. "Guess you were always a bit of a freak." Despite his still slightly bashful expression, a smirk sneaked onto James's lips, as he quite visibly and immediately enjoyed his girlfriend's contact. "Well, I was a kid with my head full of a lot of theoretical and very little practical knowledge, and even less ethics, he explained, shrugging with his not currently occupied shoulder. Though then his expression turned, well, it wasn't exactly accusing, but there were certainly hints of that, as his face turned a little more serious again while he looked back at his mother. What exactly are you getting at with pulling that old thing out? The Admiral exhaled slowly. She could imagine quite well what he meant by that, what he may be imagining her intentions to be. However, I just like looking at it whenever I'm not feeling well, she explained in complete honesty, and just couldn't help gliding her fingers over the page one more time, even though she knew it would eventually damage it if she didn't control herself. Even I'm not immune to near-death experiences. I'm in pain, and I recently had most of my leg removed. In moments like these, I just like to cheer myself up with some memories. In the core of her vision, she could see Sheeta shift a bit to look up at James's face, while her own was on his shoulder. The look on her face was slightly worried, almost as if she had a bad feeling about what James would have to say to the Admiral's explanation. Though James barely reacted to it at all. He didn't have to. He knew fully well that his mother knew fully well what he was thinking. Times like those she reminisced about were long over, and she was ultimately the reason for it. And in truth, she didn't regret the path she had chosen, both for herself and for James. Even these many years later, she felt like she had back then. That it was the right one to take. However, just because she didn't regret it, didn't mean that she couldn't rue the consequences it had brought along with it. The price she paid for her own decision, to be sure. But even if it may make her a hypocrite in some people's eyes, nobody truly liked paying prices, no matter how fair or unfair they may be. I am very proud of you, James, she said, as a moment of her own vulnerability got to her. Usually she was alone whenever she looked at this folder, so she didn't anticipate just how much having her children around, as she did, would change things. And not just for the things I influenced. She briefly shifted her gaze and looked at Nia, who was still sitting next to her. Don't get me wrong. I don't think you necessarily want or need to hear this, but the proudest day of my life was when you came to me with Nia's hand in yours. I remember it like it was yesterday, how you came to me, holding it tightly as she was crying bitter tears, and you said, I am not letting her go. Inadvertently, the Emerald felt herself well up a bit, as the memory replayed before her inner eye. The absolute despair and hopelessness on Nia's face. The burning, unwavering determination on that of James, as he stared up into his mother's eyes so steadfast that she truly felt like she could sooner divert a river from his course with her bare hands than change his conviction. The day that Nia had stopped being her son's sister and had truly become her daughter. Not able to leave it at just the thought, she lifted her injured arm, all pain be damned, and put it around Nia as she pulled her daughter closer. Maybe it was the vulnerability sourced from her memories, or maybe it was the fact that they had both come incredibly close to death in the very recent past, which reminded her of how many things had gone unsaid for a long time between them, since they both felt like nothing needed to be said through what they thought was a mutual understanding between them. But maybe, even if they were known, some things bared repeating. It's no secret that we don't really see eye to eye. I have my reasons for my actions. You have very valid reasons to still despise me for them. I don't expect we will ever go back to how things were back when you were still too young to do so, she explained, and lifted the folder up a bit as an indication of the long-gone times that would never come back. As people, even though mother and son, they were simply not compatible in that way. But Finn raised you well, just like I knew he would because he raised me well too. As her thoughts carried on, she felt her hands clench a bit, and she very quickly dropped the folder onto her lap to not accidentally damage it, while her hands instead grabbed onto each other, squeezing firmly, while a new wave of very different emotion overcame her. And, although I despise with every fibre of my being, every single moment that I know you are going through the torture of having to face these disgusting people, she carried on, her voice very briefly turning into a growl, while her gaze became knives before she managed to pull it back a bit, because she didn't want the rest of her sentence to sound like it was said begrudgingly, as she continued. And even though you and I will likely never walk side by side again, due to our difference, there is no one, and I mean no one, who I would rather walk behind in this current situation. Not because you're my son, not because you're some councilman, but because I watched how you, from a very young age, would have rather bared any wrath or consequences brought against you for it, than ever turn away from what you felt was truly right. I don't know if many think the same way. In fact, it is likely that most people won't. But frankly, I don't give a damn. Speaking briefly from her rambling, she made eye contact with James again, to fully see his reaction to her words. He seemed taken aback. Understandably so. This was incredibly different from their usual interactions, even the more peaceful ones. And it was clear that he both didn't know how honest she was being, and how much it would matter to him, even if she was. However, despite that, there was no sign of him outright dismissing her thoughts, as he quietly listened to everything she had to say. I don't deny that I put stones in your path. Like I said, I have my reasons for my actions, and you have yours for being against them. She finalized her speech while their gazes held each other intensely. But in that same vein, I also have my reasons when I guarantee you that when it comes to this whole thing, that is over now. Once and for all. I don't promise you to magically change all my ways. You're more than smart enough to know that I neither will nor want to do that. I will still remind you of your limits. I will still tell you head on when you are being brash and stupid. But in this fight, I will walk with you. Walk behind you. Because I, personally, truly think that anyone else might get it wrong. James exhaled slowly, as they still held each other's gaze. A good part of him seemed truly flabbergasted and unsure of what to say or how to react. He also didn't seem to know if he wanted to be proud, hesitant, appreciative, or angry. In the end, his hand moved up to his face, his palm brushing over his forehead while his fingers combed some hair out of the way. I feel like I've been getting it wrong a whole lot too often for anyone to be saying such things, he mumbled, as he was the first to break eye contact, looking at his palm instead. She'd pressed up a bit tighter to him at those words, and Nia also looked over to him with a worried expression. The Admiral, however, simply released a bit of a scoff through her teeth at his misplaced bashfulness. I have lambasted you for your mistakes more than enough for you to know that I am very aware of them, she reminded him, in a now much sterner tone, removing her arm from around Nia's shoulders to place both her hands firmly on her lap while she sat up, which briefly caused Nia to vainly attempt to stop her from doing so out of worry. And with some of your old ones, they were more than worth lambasting. Your cockiness and need to apply can also still use some serious work. However, given these recent events, I would be willing to bet that you count many of them among the times you got it wrong as well, don't you? She looked at him directly, making sure to not leave a single doubt that she expected him to answer her honestly. James in turn hesitated for a long moment before he sighed. Briefly, his eyes shot down to Sheeta's face, a barely concealed pain and fear behind them as they quivered slightly, and quickly pulled away again. It's quite obvious, isn't it? He mumbled, and his tone made it clear that he wasn't referring to him blaming himself being obvious, but instead the blame obviously lying on him. Admiral Krieger gave Nia a reassuring motion as she allowed her daughter to gently aid her in fully lying down again. She removed her gaze from James for a moment to take a bit of pressure off him as she looked straight up. James, do you remember the order you got during the Conference of Primates? The one decided on by a majority vote in the Council of Governance? She asked, without looking over at him. Once again, James hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure if he didn't want to answer immediately, or if he actually needed a moment to recall. Break everything wide open and keep no more secrets, he finally said, his voice alone leaving his emotional state unreadable. Also, take your good arm and throw shit at the fan. The Admiral nodded into her pillow. And do you remember the stipulation that was attached to that order? She asked him further, in a neutral tone that was meant to not influence him whatsoever. This time, James's pause didn't last quite as long before he responded. His voice had shifted the slightest bit to the positive as he said, "We'll deal with the consequences." Again, the Admiral nodded. "When it was decided to reveal our allegiance with a real eyes to the world, nobody expected it to go smoothly," she then said in a serious tone. "A Veselon breaking into systems to save your life, fighting off people coming after you by any means necessary, even shooting entire terrorist fleets out of the damn sky. It's all dealing with the consequences." She rolled her head over a bit so she could look at him again, her eyes immediately finding his as he was staring at her. "I'll be the first to tell you when you fuck up," she said in a stern tone that was simultaneously meant to be reassuring. "There's no need to try and do it yourself, so I better not catch you beating yourself up once I'm allowed out of here again, or you'll be running laps till you drop." Everyone's eyes turned from her onto James, as the entire room awaited his reaction. James remained stone-faced for a long couple of moments as he seemed to process her words fully. Then, his chest twitched a bit as he released a mix of a single laugh and a sigh, his face twisting into reluctant yet resigned amusement. "I can't believe I'm not hating you right now," he finally replied under his breath. And that was more than enough for Sophia. With one of his claws rhythmically tapping on the surface, Reprig stared down onto the screen of his assistant. The High Matriarch's speech had once again been broadcast all over the station, through the various extendable screens that seemed to be built into all kinds of surfaces in this absolutely technologically riddled place. There was an urge within him to make contact, to get further clarifications, answers, anything. How real was what the High Matriarch had just said? How real wasn't it? And how much of it was? He had absolutely no idea how to feel about her words right now. They were so contrary to so many things he knew her beliefs to be, and simultaneously they rang true in so many other regards. There was no way she would have attacked the Coivery. There couldn't have been. That part had to be true, and what she reported of the actions of the humans sounded like it would be senseless to lie about, so that part also had to be true. But if those were, then how much else would be? He truly wanted to make contact right now. However, while his claw still tapped, his gaze briefly shifted over to the human, sitting at the table with them. It was a slightly up there in age male, with dark yet greying hair and tan skin. As his covering, he had chosen what Reprig could by now identify as one of the Deathworld's dark formal suits, and on his head was a flat hat that covered part of his face. The man hadn't bothered introducing himself when he sat down with them. Reprig doubted that fact would change any time soon. But although his eyes were covered by the rim of his large head from Reprig's perspective, the Sipper Slang knew instinctively that they were still focused right on him. He could feel the gaze. It was intense, and he wouldn't miss any slip-ups. So, this was reason. Or, well, a small part of it. As long as they would sit here together like this, he would have to let things slide, so that no further suspicion could arise. He also doubted that it would be a good idea to excuse himself, in order to make a phone call or send some messages. And so he simply remained alone with his worries and thoughts, as he sat there and tapped his claw. On his other side, the younger one of the Raphaelite's children sat. Humwa was her name. By all means, a rather innocent-seeming girl. It was unlikely she actually had anything to do at all with this entire situation. She was probably just pulled into it by her mother, and now followed whatever the elder led her to. Reprig grimaced briefly, as he momentarily caught himself thinking like Alexander. All that talk about paths and leaders and dangers along the way must have dug into his brain somehow. He directed his gaze away from the young woman again, and instead turned it to Head. The abomination was using some sort of human device to transform their earlier sketch into a more realized model of a possible contraption of... Reprig caught himself shuddering at the thought of ramming anything into the stump of his leg to try and use as a substitute. Then, as if they had heard his thoughts, the cyborg suddenly spoke up, their words clearly directed at him, even as their eyes remained on the screen in front of them. "Tell me, how exactly would you expect a possible prosthesis to be attached to your leg?" they asked out of the blue, leaving Reprig stumped for a moment. He felt his fur stand up along his arms as he briefly tried to force himself to think about it, but before he could get too into it, he sighed. Briefly, he glanced over at the man from Reason, wondering if it was a good idea to even say anything in front of him. However, that was just foolish thinking in the end. He was hardly about to reveal anything that the humans didn't already know here. You aren't really still expecting me to actually go along with the whole replacement idea, are you? The Sippersling therefore wondered aloud, as he looked back at the abomination's black body. He knew he had brought the topic up as a way to engage with them, but there was no way they had taken it seriously for even a moment, right? And they knew him, and they knew there was no way he would let a thing like that anywhere near his body. Surely they did. The cyborg briefly stopped their work to look over at him, their emotionless metal mask of a face blankly staring back at him. I don't expect anything of you, they replied with that unnatural voice that used to give him shivers just listening to it, even if that reaction has subsided by now the more time he spent around them. However, you asked me about it, and apart from cleaning up my legal defense, there is very little in terms of enriching work that I am currently able and allowed to do on this station due to my situation. Therefore, I will seriously work on this, even if just as a distraction. Reprig paused for a couple of moments, keeping his gaze on those red eyes before he shifted a bit. I mean, you would implant it, wouldn't you? He finally said. He wasn't going to get anywhere with the eyes of that Reason guy on him. He might as well humour this conversation for a bit. It would probably be uncomfortable, but it would certainly pass the time and keep him from getting too deep into his own head. To his surprise, the cyborg shook their body a bit. I very highly doubt that would be to your liking, they replied, surprisingly earnest, and briefly glanced at their screen again before looking back at him. I am aware of your dislike of modifications to your own body, therefore any permanent attachment could not possibly be in your best interest, they explained further, and briefly glanced at the crutch he had to use to get around. However, it is also clear that not any kind of walking aid is out of the question. Therefore, I am trying to understand where exactly to draw the line and what compromises you may be comfortable with. With one of their large legs, the cyborg then turned the device they were working on around to present the model they designed to him. People in the past used prostheses that basically just had a bed for the remaining parts of the limb that simply strapped to it. The prosthesis itself was then used for a mixture of and adapted gait, as well as clever placement of joints that would mimic natural movements without the need of actual nerve connections, they explained, and pointed towards a sort of cup at the top of the leg model, the whole of which was sort of shaped like a downwards pointing sickle in a way. Or, in even earlier times, they just used a stiff piece of material to support them while walking, sort of like a crutch, but simply fastened to your leg instead of carried under your arm. Reprig stared at the screen briefly as he, at the very least, thought about the words, if only to distract himself. It wasn't like those explanations changed anything. Simply strap it to your leg? He wanted aloud in a bored manner for a moment, as he looked at the cup that would, in such a case, be holding his leg stump. You would regularly have to take it off, and precautions will have to be taken against chafing and other wear stresses, the cyborg explained further. It comes with many hurdles, and is by no means a full replacement for your natural leg. However, it would greatly aid in your mobility, while also freeing up your arm from being involved in your movement. Reprig looked at the screen for a moment longer, while he still tried to suppress his urge to try and get answers right that minute. And somehow, those words of the cyborg stuck in his mind, echoing back at him from its recesses. Not a replacement.